Hi, I'm Mark Gaylor. I'd like to run you through some of the basic editing workflows when working inside of Lightroom's Develop module. Here you can see I am in the Develop module. Just press the D key on your keyboard to take the image into the Develop module. I have my toolbar open. Just press the T key if you need to access that toolbar. I've also got my panels, and I'm working with my panels in solo mode. Here I've selected solo mode by right-clicking on any of the panels here. This means that if I open another panel, the first one closes. This means that I won't have to scroll backwards and forwards looking for the controls that I want to use. I'll be able to see all of the panels at any one time. Okay, now we might want to jump in and start editing the color and tone of the image, but I actually usually start with the Lens Corrections panel. And I want to make sure that the Enable Profile Corrections and the Remove Chromatic Aberration and Constrain Crop are all checked. If we go over to the Profile panel, you can see that the Enable Profile Corrections has pricked up the lens profile for this particular lens, which is a Sigma 2470. This helps remove some of the distortions from the lens. I've made no other corrections to this image at this time, and if I want these settings to be always applied as the images are imported into Lightroom, all I have to do is hold down the Alt key on a PC or the Option key on a Mac and click on Set Default, and you'll come up with this dialog, and I can update to current settings. Okay, now there is a little bit of warning that these changes are not undoable, but that's not too much of a concern. I'll just click on this update to current settings to show you what I mean. If I hit reset now, these settings will remain checked, i.e. the profile corrections and the chromatic aberration will remain fixed for me. If I ever want to go back for any reason and remove these, I can simply uncheck them, or again just go to Set Default with these unchecked, and that will zero it back to the Adobe defaults. I'll just do that for you, Set Default, and I can restore Adobe defaults here. And that means if I now reset the image, all of that chromatic aberration and profile corrections will be removed from the image. Okay, so I'll just do that one again. I'll check those and choose Set Default and Update to Current Settings. I'll now know that all of the images I import using this camera and lens combination will automatically be corrected for me. And now I can jump into making my adjustments, my workflow adjustments. The first thing that I see with this image is the exposure is a little bit too bright. I'll just drop that down by about 1 stop exposure. Okay, the beauty of working with RAW is sometimes when information looks like it's actually being clipped or overexposed, it can be brought back in with a combination of exposure, highlights and the white slider. Okay, the exposure mostly controls the brightness, the overall brightness of the image in the central portion of this histogram here. Okay, now we're going to check the white balance of the image. Now this can be a subjective thing. At the moment it's using the white balance that was used by the camera, but I could for instance choose one of the other presets such as daylight here. This goes a little bit too red for me, so what I might do is I might choose to set the white balance using another technique, which is to select the white balance tool here and then select or click on something neutral within the image here. Let's just click on this white tablecloth to set that as the white balance. It's actually a good deal cooler than daylight, and this is a more pleasing white balance, more natural white balance for me. Okay, the colours seems to be a little bit washed out for me however, so I'm going to take the vibrant slider and raise that to +50. Now this is usually preferred when increasing the richness of the colours to the saturation, which can push some of the colours out of gamut. It can render them slightly without texture if we push that too high. The only problem with raising the vibrant slider is it is programmed to ignore to some extent colours that look a little bit like skin tones, and so if we have some warm sand here that looks a little bit like flesh tones, that won't be as pushed or made as vibrant as some of the other colors, and so sometimes we can just follow in with a little bit of saturation to make sure that those colors become as vibrant as the rest of the colors. I'm now going to add some contrast to this image. I'm going to raise the contrast just to around about 20, just to give that a little bit more drama into the image. Now we can control highlights and shadows independently. For instance, we have a big area of shadows in these cliffs here, and I can raise those just by pushing that shadows, and that will focus its attention on those darker tones. They're not too dark for me at the moment, so I may just leave them there, or maybe just make them a little bit brighter. The highlight slider will focus its attention on the brightest highlights, such as the areas in the sky, or maybe that tablecloth, even though that's moving down more towards a mid-tone. And as we push that down, as you can see, it's focusing its attention mostly on the sky there. Now I'm just going to leave that at a slightly lower value, because there's an alternative way I can pull down the brightness of that sky. Now typically, if I'm just doing a quick edit, I would finish up with the whites and black sliders. Okay, and this is just to ensure that we're using the full dynamic range of the histogram here. We can click on these clipping warnings to see whether any areas within the image are clipping. For instance, if I push this white slider now, you'll see these areas that light up red. They're showing that they're becoming overexposed. Okay, so I'll just zero that. Likewise, if we push the blacks down, we can create clipping in some of the shadow areas. We will re-render them without surface texture. Okay, so neither of those are optimum. However, we should try and set a black point. There's a small gap at the end of the histogram, so I can actually lower this a small amount. If you want more detailed feedback than just clicking on these clipping warnings, I can unselect them. We can actually hold down the Alt key on a PC or the Option key on a Mac, and then click on the black slider and then start moving it left until we see something appear in the window. As soon as we start seeing some clipping appearing, then we back off until we just have a very, very small minimal amount of clipping, perhaps right underneath that table there. We wouldn't really expect to see any detail. Okay, so same with the white slider, is I can hold down the Alt Option key and click on the whites, and we can raise the whites. Now we already start getting some clipping in that flag, so I'm going to have to pull that back down, maybe down to -8 to protect the highlights in that flag area. Okay, so now we've done the basic adjustments. What I might like to do is I might like to create a snapshot. This gets a recording of the image in this state. Okay, so Command N on a Mac or Control N on a PC will create a snapshot that will allow me to return to this at any time. By default it's got a date and a time, but I can rename that if I like. And we can access the snapshots via the snapshots panel. I'll just cancel that out so you can see the snapshots panel there. Let's just move this window slightly over so we can access that small triangle there. And I'll just show you that here's the snapshots panel that we have, and we can click and create snapshots at any time in the future. And as you can see, I've been working with this image before and I've created variations. Okay, so I'll just collapse that panel again. You can actually use the function keys on the keyboard. F7 for instance will collapse that left hand panel, okay, and bring us back into that full screen view. Okay, what I'd like to do now is to work with some localized adjustments. First of all, we'll start with the HSL tab, and we have this little targeted adjustment tool here, a little radio button which we can click on. After we've finished working in this panel, we must remember to click on the Done button. Okay. The first thing I'm going to do is control the luminance or brightness of that sky. I simply click inside the sky area and drag down to make it darker. I'm going to drag it down to maybe -40 or so in order to create a nice dark sky. It's a little bit too saturated for me, so I might come to the saturation tab and drag the saturation down so it's not quite so vibrant, like so. We can also change the hue of that sky. If we want to make it a more cyan, we could drag down, or if we want to make it a more richer sort of royal blue, then we could drag it up a little way. Here I've gone down to a value of +9 on those blues. And you can see as we click and drag inside the image, it targets the appropriate colors for us. We can physically move and drag these sliders, but it's so much easier to work on the image itself. And now that I've finished with the hue, saturation and luminance, I am free to click on that Done button, and I can return to the basic panel. Okay, the next adjustment I'm going to make is I'm going to add some graduated filters. We can press M on the keyboard to access the graduated filter. Often skies appear a lot brighter than we remember them, and so I often like to drag in what I describe as a neutral density filter over the sky, just to make it a little bit darker. If you've been working in this panel before and you've already got settings here, just double clicking the word effect will zero all of these sliders. I'm then free to come in and make an adjustment. I'll just drag the exposure slider down, perhaps to maybe 2/3 to 1 stop. I can adjust these settings later. I'll just click quite high in the sky and then drag down towards that horizon line. If I'm slightly crooked, just holding down the shift key will constrain that gradient to a perfect vertical, like so. If I think that's a little bit excessive, then I can just back up slightly on that, maybe to a half a stop or so. Okay, I might also add an additional gradient to the foreground. Just by clicking at the bottom of the image, I can, again, just holding down the shift key, constrain that and bring that up to the bottom of those tables there. I'd like this second gradient to be a little bit darker, so I'll just drag that exposure down a little bit more. And I don't want it to be too saturated, so I'll just drag some of the saturation out from that foreground like so. If I ever wanted to go back and edit the first gradient, all I need to do is click on the little radio button or pin, and then that gives me access to those settings for that graduated filter. Okay, now I'm finished with the graduated filters. I'll click on that icon and that will collapse that panel. If I want to, now I'm noticing this as we've dragged the graduated filter, this cliff is starting to get a little bit dark. Now I could go back and start raising the shadows values. Alternatively, I can work in a localized way with an adjustment brush here. Okay, again, double clicking on the word effect to zero all the sliders. Here I'm going to work with a positive exposure value, maybe 2/3 of a stop brighter. Okay, now typically when I'm working with the adjustment brush, I like to work with the auto mask off. Okay, and I'll have the feather and flow and density all set to 100. Now we can change the size of the brush using this slider here. Alternatively, I can use the square bracket keys. Here I'm choosing the open square bracket key, which reduces the size of the brush, and the close square bracket key, which will increase the size of the brush. And now I can simply just paint with that exposure over the area that I want to make brighter, like so. Okay, now that's a little bit too bright for me, so I'm going to back up maybe just to 1/3 of a stop. Now the other thing you'll notice is if I put my mouse cursor over the pin, it'll show that some of that tone has been spilling into the sky, some of the adjustment. Okay, now if we want to remove that adjustment, what we can do is just hold down the Option or Alt key, and that allows me to erase some of that work. Now this is typically where I do like to work with the auto mask switched on. Okay, I can come in and then I can just keep that cursor behind the high contrast edges, and this will allow me to remove any of the spill of the exposure that has moved into that sky area. That's quite a subtle adjustment, but what I am doing is making sure that there's no halo kicking up from that area. Now if I put my pin over the cursor again, you'll see quite quickly that we've now held that adjustment behind the cliffs here. Okay, now that I've worked effectively on that localized adjustment with the brush, I'm free to close that panel just by clicking on that tool once again. Okay, what I'm going to do now is there's another localized adjustment, and that is to come into a vignette. Now we do have vignetting control in lens corrections, but if we've been cropping the image, we need to come to the effects panel in order to add a vignette. And typically the best two styles for vignette are highlight priority, or my preference is for color priority. This is less likely to clip any of the darker tones in the corner of the image. Okay, I can now just bring that down. I'll come down to a value of around about -20, just to darken the corners of the image slightly. Okay, if you do have any highlights sitting at the edges and that you don't want them to also be darkened, then you can raise the highlight slider, although we don't have that problem in this particular image. Okay, again I'll click on the basics panel to come back to the starting point. Now I just want to check whether there's any dust spots in this image. This image was captured while I was working in the desert, and I do know that the sensor was a little bit dirty during that period. Okay, so I'm just going to click on the spot removal tool, and we're going to come down into our toolbar and click on visualize spots. Okay, now we have this slider. We can try and identify where the dust spots are inside of this image, and as I drag it to the right, we can see those telltale dust spots inside. If we drag it too far, we'll start seeing some of the cloud structure in the sky as well. So I'll just back that up, and so the only thing we see are those dust spots. And then we want to come in with a brush size that is just slightly larger than the dust spot itself, and then we simply move over those dust spots and click, and click a second time. Now if the source point for healing the area is inappropriate, then we can just move that out of the way of the edge of the cliff there, and I'll just come and fix up the rest of the dust spots. Photoshop often tries to guess the most appropriate point, but sometimes it does get it wrong, and so we do need to swing those adjustment points out to an alternative area, like so, and just perhaps one remaining one there, and then we can click off the visualize spots. This makes sure that when we go and print the image, we don't suddenly find the spots that we fail to notice when working on our monitor. And again I'll click on that tool to close that tool. Okay, now we're going to work with sharpening the image. Okay, sharpening the image, we will come to the Detail tab. Okay, now by default there is a small amount of sharpening inside of this image already. It's also recommended to zoom in. Now we can use this panel, but this panel is quite small to see what is going on. If we wanted to focus on an area that we wanted to see how the sharpening was working, we could just click maybe on that flag, and we can see that flag and how that sharpening will play out over that area of information. Now in order to explain sharpening in detail, what I'd like to do is just open up this left hand panel, and I'm going to come in to an increased magnification here, and I'm just going to move that box inside of the navigator window to that flag. Now normally we don't see images or this much information, but it'll help highlight what is actually happening during the sharpening process, so that you can understand fully the sharpening. Okay, now the amount is controlling how much darker or lighter the tones become at the edge. Maybe I'll even zoom in one more time Okay, let's perhaps go to an even bigger magnification, because I really do want you to see what is going on at these edges here. Okay, and we'll just collapse that panel. Okay, so the amount slider is controlling the how much darker or lighter at the edges the tones are being made. So if we increase the sharpening amount, you'll see the edges will become darker on the dark side of the edge and light on the light side of the edge. Also, sharpening will also exaggerate image artifacts that we can see happening here. If I increase the radius, let's increase the radius all of the way up as well, you'll see the sharpening is now happening over a broader side of that edge that it finds. Okay, so typically if the images are captured sharp in camera, the default radius of 1 is most appropriate for sharpening. And typically if we're going over 100, we are going to be highlighting some of those image artifacts. I'm going to leave that very high because there's another way of restricting sharpening to the edges only, and that is to use this final slider here called the masking slider. If I hold down the Option or Alt key and then click and raise that mask, you can see that we can quite quickly pull back the sharpening to the areas that we see as being white only. Okay, so that will remove any artifacts in the smoother continuous tones, as we can see there. I'll now drop the sharpening amount back to a much more reasonable, maybe 70 or 80, which even that would be considered as quite a heavy sharpening amount. Okay, and I'll zoom back out to the fit-in view. Okay. So now we have sharpened the image. We could turn our attention to noise reduction if we had been working with high ISOs, but as you can see, this image was captured with a low 200 ISO, and so there will be nothing to do with noise reduction in this particular workflow that we're working with today. Okay, the other way we can create a workflow, you saw that we took a snapshot earlier, is probably appropriate now to add an additional snapshot to the snapshots panel. So I'll just Command N or Control N on a PC and create a new snapshot, because we've done a significant amount of work since we took the last snapshot. Okay, and that basically runs through all of the basic edits that I typically would go through when editing an image. And if I show you now a reset, you'll see how far that the image came from the before and after going through those basic global and localized edits.